The house at the end of Calloway Street was the kind of place that made people cross to the other side of the road. It wasn't falling apart, not exactly. The paint was fresh, the hedges were trimmed, and the windows gleamed. But there was something about it that settled wrong in the gut, the way a smile can be technically correct and still make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The Vorens had owned it for 3 years, since the Resettlement Act had opened up the residential zones to non-human families, and in those 3 years, not one neighbor had been invited inside. Marcus Webb had lived across the street for 11 of his 42 years. He was a quiet man. He'd been a field medic in the border campaigns, the ones they didn't put in the history books, and quiet was something he'd earned the hard way. He ran a small practice out of his home now, treating mostly elderly humans and the occasional alien who'd been turned away from the overcrowded resettlement clinics. He didn't ask for much from the world. He drank his coffee on the porch every morning. He kept his opinions to himself. But Marcus Webb noticed things. That was the medic in him. You trained yourself to see what people wanted to hide. He'd noticed the Vorens the day they moved in. There were 4 of them. Harvin Voren, the patriarch, was a Salathi, one of the blue-gray, 6-limbed species from the Cedral system. He was tall, elegantly dressed, and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had practiced human languages until the accent became a performance. His wife, Uselda, was quieter. She drifted. Her movements had the disconnected quality of someone who had learned to make herself small. Then there were the children. 2 sons, Breton and Corvin, teenagers by the look of them, already carrying their father's arrogant set in their shoulders. And then, trailing behind them, barely visible between the moving boxes and the furniture haulers. A girl. She was small, too small. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old in human terms, though Salathi aging was different. Marcus had read enough to know that. She had the same blue-gray coloring as the rest of the family, but where the others had a kind of polished sheen to their complexions, hers was dull, flat. The 4 secondary limbs that Salathi grew in childhood delicate, meant to blossom into the full adult appendages, were curled close to her body the way a creature curls when it expects to be struck. She'd carried a box that was too heavy for her and stumbled on the front steps. Harvin Voren had not looked back. Marcus had gone inside and made himself another cup of coffee and told himself it wasn't his business. He'd been telling himself that for 3 years. The problem with telling yourself something isn't your business is that the part of you that's a field medic doesn't switch off just because the part of you that wants a quiet life wishes it would. Marcus had patched up enough people in enough bad situations to know what he was looking at when he looked at it. And what he was looking at when he looked at that girl was someone in the specific, grinding category of harm that doesn't announce itself and doesn't leave obvious marks and proceeds for years in plain sight, because everyone involved has a reason to not quite look directly at it. The neighbors didn't look because they'd been told, gently and persistently, that Salathi family structures were different and that interfering would be anti-alien bias. The resettlement office didn't look because they were understaffed and their mandate was housing compliance, not welfare follow-up. The Cedral consulate very actively didn't look because Harvin Voren was the kind of well-connected Salathi who made things awkward for anyone who created problems for him. Everyone, in short, had decided on a different version of "it's not my business." Marcus drank his coffee and thought about that, and about the specific weight of a box that was too heavy for a child, and about a man who did not look back. He'd been telling himself that for 3 years. The first time he saw her eat, it was an accident. He was returning from a late house call, old Mrs. Petrenko 2 blocks over, her knees again, and he cut through the alley behind Calloway Street because the front path was flooded from an afternoon storm. The Vorens' back gate was ajar. Not open, just ajar, the way gates go when the latch doesn't quite catch and the wind has been at it. He would have walked past. He would have, except that he heard a sound. It was a small sound, rhythmic, careful, like something trying very hard not to make noise at all and almost succeeding. Marcus stopped. The medic part of his brain, the part that never fully went off duty, made him stop. He looked through the gap in the gate. The back garden was dim in the evening light. The main house glowed warm and gold from within. He could hear the muffled sound of the family at dinner, the clink of utensils against Salathi ceramicware, the low rumble of Harvin Voran's voice holding court. Out here in the garden, a single light burned over the back step, a utility light, the kind meant to illuminate the bins. The girl was crouched on the ground beneath it. She had a metal bowl. Not a plate, a bowl, the shallow kind used for scraps, the sort Marcus had seen put out for working dogs in the agricultural settlements. And she was eating from it, not with utensils. With her primary hands, 2 fingers carefully extracting whatever was in the bowl, bringing it to her mouth with a focused concentration that was somehow more heartbreaking than any dramatic gesture could have been. She was eating the family's leftovers, bones still attached, scraps from the evening's meal, the parts that the others hadn't wanted. She ate the way someone eats when they are very hungry, and have learned to be grateful for whatever appears. Marcus Webb stood at that gate for a long moment. He thought about what he knew of Salathi culture. He thought about the Resettlement Act, and the Alien Family Services Office that was chronically understaffed and hadn't made a single follow-up visit to this street in 2 years. He thought about a 7-year-old girl with dull coloring and curled secondary limbs, and a bowl on the ground. He thought about crossing to the other side of the road. Then he went home and couldn't sleep. Part 2. The doctor pays attention. He started watching. Not obviously, he wasn't the type for binoculars and notebooks, but his porch coffee became a ritual time to when the Voran household stirred in the mornings. He found reasons to be in the front garden in the evenings. He made note of what he saw. The 2 sons left for school in pressed uniforms, backpacks that looked new, carrying the portable learning tablets that the better resettlement schools provided to non-human students. They were picked up by a private transport, the kind that cost money, the kind that announced a family that had arrived in every sense of the word. Uselda Voran left twice a week for what Marcus assumed were social calls, always dressed impeccably, always without looking back at the house. Harvin Voran left in a sleek transport every morning and returned in the evenings with the satisfied air of someone who considered the world to be proceeding according to plan. The girl did not leave. He never saw her at a school transport stop. He never saw her in the private vehicle. 3 years of living across the street, and Marcus Webb had never once seen the girl leave that house. He began to notice other things. The way she appeared at the upstairs window sometimes, early morning, watching the street with an expression he couldn't quite read from across the road, not longing, exactly. Something older than longing. Something that had given up on longing and settled for observation. The way, when the brothers came home from school, she would vanish. One moment she'd be in the garden and then she simply wouldn't be. The way she moved, always along the edges of things, walls, fences, the boundary of whatever space she'd been permitted to occupy. She had a name. He'd heard Harvin use it once, when the man had come to the back garden to collect something from the storage shed and found the girl in his path. He'd said it the way you say a word that inconveniences you, Lyra, out of the way. And she had moved immediately, completely, folding herself into the corner of the garden like she'd been practicing disappearance. Lyra. Marcus repeated it to himself on his porch one morning. He didn't know what it meant in Salathi. He suspected it didn't matter to the people inside that house. The approach took him 6 weeks to plan. He wasn't impulsive, another thing the border campaigns had trained out of him. You didn't act on what you suspected. You confirmed, carefully, and then you acted on what you knew. You also thought 3 steps ahead, because the wrong move in the wrong situation made things worse, and the people who paid for wrong moves were always the ones who could least afford to. He called in a favor with a contact at the Regional Alien Services Bureau, a woman named Tran Fuang, who had actually done her job despite everything, and who had been quietly horrified when Marcus described what he'd seen. "A bowl on the ground," she repeated. "A bowl on the ground," Marcus confirmed. There was a long silence on the line. "Marcus," she said finally, "I need you to understand that if I go in there without evidence, they'll shut it down. The Vorons have a legal team. Harvin Voron has 3 separate cultural ambassadorships in his background, and the Cedral Consulate will scream about anti-Salathi prejudice within 48 hours of any formal inquiry. I know. I need documentation, dates, times, specific observations. I have 6 weeks of notes." Another silence. "That's a start, but Marcus, be careful how you proceed from here, if he realizes you've been watching." "He won't," Marcus said. "I'm very boring." He heard her exhale. "I'll start the pre-inquiry paperwork, quietly." The direct contact happened on a Tuesday in November. It was raining, real rain, the kind that came in sideways, that made the street empty out by 9 in the morning. Marcus was returning from an early house call when he saw Lyra in the front garden. She was collecting the post from the gate, in the rain, without a coat. The Salathi were not warm-blooded in the human sense, but they were sensitive to temperature. Their secondary limbs were particularly vulnerable to cold, the joints stiffening in ways that Marcus knew from his medical reading were painful. She had her secondary limbs pressed to her torso, hunched over the post box, fingers fumbling because they were stiff. He crossed the street before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. "Hey," he said. She spun around. The look on her face, pure, unguarded terror, the eyes going wide and the secondary limbs flinching inward. That look lodged itself somewhere behind Marcus's sternum and did not move. "It's okay," he said, in the careful tone he used with frightened children of any species. "I'm your neighbor, Marcus. I live across the street," he pointed. "The blue door." She looked at him. She looked at the blue door. She looked back at him. "You're cold," he said simply. She blinked. It was the blink of someone who had been told an obvious thing and didn't know what to do with the acknowledgement. "I have," he reached into his bag. He always carried an emergency thermal wrap, the compact kind that folded to the size of a paperback. Standard field medic habit. "This won't fit right, but it'll help." He held it out, not moving toward her, held it out and waited. She stared at it. "You don't have to take it," he said. "It's just there if you want it." 11 seconds. He counted without meaning to. Then, slowly, one of her primary hands reached out and took the thermal wrap from his hand. She didn't run inside. She just stood there, holding it, looking at him with an expression that he recognized with a pang. It was the expression of someone trying to locate the catch. "There's no catch," he said, which surprised her enough that she almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Thank you," she said. Her accent was careful, formal, the educated galactic standard of someone who'd learned it from a recording rather than from conversation. "Dr. Webb." He raised an eyebrow. "You know who I am." "You have a medical sign by your door," she said. "I can read." Despite everything, Marcus Webb felt the corner of his own mouth pull upward. "Fair point," he said. "You'd better get inside. Your secondary joints will thank you." She looked at the thermal wrap in her hands, then at him. "Take it with you," he said. "I've got more." He watched her go back inside. He stood in the rain for a moment after the door closed. Then he went home and called Tran Fuang again. He began to learn to read her distances. That was how he thought of it, distances. Lyra existed at different distances from the world on different days, and learning the difference between them was its own kind of science. There was the maximum distance version, the one she wore when Harvin Voren was in the garden or the brothers were visible from the street. A version so controlled and compacted that she barely seemed to take up three-dimensional space at all. There was the medium-distance version, the one she wore most of the time, which was still controlled but less exhaustingly so, which allowed for small gestures and something approaching a neutral expression. And then, very rarely, on days when the house was quiet and the garden was just garden, there was a third version that Marcus could barely glimpse from across the street before it disappeared, something quicker, something that looked at the world rather than monitoring it, something that he would have called, in a child with different circumstances, simply young. He kept those observations too, not for the Bureau, not yet, just for himself, because he wanted to know exactly what was there before anyone else got involved, and because some stubborn part of him wanted to know what she was like when nobody was watching her survive. What he concluded, over 6 weeks of porch coffee vigilance, was this: the girl across the street was someone. That shouldn't have been a remarkable observation. Every child is someone. But there was a specific quality to her someone-ness that he found himself thinking about at odd moments, when he was at Mrs. Petrenko's knees, or writing up his patient notes at the end of the day, or lying awake at midnight the way he sometimes did since the border campaigns. She was systematic in a way that spoke of a mind that hadn't stopped just because it was given no material. She read. She observed. She had, he was increasingly certain, made herself into the most knowledgeable entity in that household regarding her own legal and practical situation, working from whatever the household databank allowed her to access. And she had done this not in despair, but in something that he recognized, that he had seen in the field, that he thought of as a kind of readiness. She was waiting for conditions to change. She had decided they would. He had enormous respect for that. Part 3. What the doctor learned. He learned her story in pieces. Not from her, not at first. He learned it the way he'd learned everything in the field, from context, from what wasn't said, from the shape of the silence around the thing itself. He researched Salathi family structures, which were complex in ways that the standard alien integration pamphlets glossed over entirely. He learned that Salathi clans operated on a system of bloodline rankings, that the primary bloodline children, the sons, were inheritors and public-facing members of the clan, and that in certain families, particularly in the more traditional clans, there were children who occupied a different category. Secondary born, children from a first pairing before the formal clan marriage. Children who existed in a legal gray zone that the Cedral homeworld had spent 2 centuries slowly dismantling, but which older, more conservative families still practiced in private. The word for it in Salathi was something that translated approximately as the thread that does not bind. A child acknowledged enough to be kept, not acknowledged enough to matter. Marcus sat with that for a long time. He thought about Lyra's dull coloring, the sign of malnutrition in Salathi children, he confirmed with a specialist contact in the alien medical network. He thought about the curled secondary limbs, which in a healthy Salathi child of her apparent age should have been extending, stretching, beginning the slow bloom that would characterize adult development. Stress and malnutrition could stunt them. He hadn't needed the specialist to tell him that he'd seen it in the field. He thought about the bowl on the ground. He also learned, and this was the thing that kept him awake, that the practice wasn't a secret. It was hiding in plain sight, the way things do when they're old enough and quiet enough that people have learned not to look directly at them. The secondary-born classification was documented in Salathi clan records. It was listed, with clinical neutrality, in the cultural briefing documents that had been provided to resettlement housing officers when the Vorens had moved in. The housing officer had read it, noted it, and had not thought to flag it because there was nothing technically illegal about it on the document's face, and because Marcus suspected, though he was too careful to say so without evidence, because it was a Salathi internal family matter, and the housing officer had been trained, as everyone had been trained, to be careful about the optics of challenging alien cultural practices. Meanwhile, a child had been eating from a bowl on the ground for 3 years. He filed his observations formally with Tran Fuang. He kept them factual. He did not let himself feel what he felt about them until he was alone on his porch in the evenings. And then he let himself feel it exactly as much as he needed to and no more. Because losing control of your feelings was how you made mistakes, and he was not going to make a mistake that cost Lyra anything. There was one other thing he learned, and this one he learned not from databases and medical contacts, but from watching. He had been keeping his morning porch coffee vigil on a Saturday in October when Lyra had appeared at the upstairs window, the small one on the east side of the house, which looked out over the garden and the street, and beyond the street, Marcus's own front gate where he sat with his mug. She hadn't seen him at first. She was looking at the sky. It was a clear morning, the kind that came rarely in the autumn, and the light was doing something remarkable to the clouds on the eastern horizon. She was looking at the sky the way that Marcus, in his better moments, looked at his coffee before the first sip, not performing anything, not managing anything, just present in the fact of the thing. And then she looked down and she saw him, and he raised his mug very slightly, and she went completely still. He didn't wave, he didn't gesture. He raised his mug and he nodded once in acknowledgement, "I see you." Not, "I'm watching." Not, "I've noticed something is wrong." Just, "I see you." One human being to another creature across a street on a clear October morning. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and disappeared back into the house. But the next morning she was at the window again, and the morning after that. And Marcus raised his mug, and she watched him, and it was the smallest thing in the world, and also, he thought, something more than the smallest thing in the world. He saw her again 3 weeks later. She appeared at his gate on a Sunday afternoon, standing very straight, both primary hands clasped in front of her. She had the thermal wrap folded precisely over one arm. She held it out to him. "I came to return this," she said. "Thank you for the loan." He looked at the wrap. He looked at her. He had about 14 things he wanted to say and said none of them. "Keep it," he said. "I really do have more." "I cannot keep something that doesn't belong to me," she said, very seriously. The kind of serious that has been imposed from outside and worn long enough to feel like a personality. Marcus regarded her for a moment. Then he said, "Would you like to come in for tea?" The look on her face was extraordinary. It cycled through shock, suspicion, and something he couldn't name in the space of about 2 seconds, and then settled into a careful blankness that he recognized as the protective mask of someone who has learned that wanting things leads to pain. "I would need to be back before the family returns," she said. The family, he noted, not my family, not father or mother, the family. "They're at the Cedral Consulate reception," he said, because he'd seen them leave 2 hours ago, dressed for an official event. "That's at least 4 hours. Another long moment of calculation, behind careful eyes. "All right," she said, "tea would be acceptable." She sat in his kitchen with the uprightness of a child who had been taught that slumping was a moral failing, and she drank the tea he made. He'd looked up salathisafe preparations, served it with a supplemental mineral tablet dissolved in the way the alien medical resources recommended. And she answered his careful questions with the careful answers of someone who had learned to give nothing away. He asked about the things that couldn't hurt her, what she liked to read, whether she'd seen the moon last night, it had been remarkable, low and orange on the horizon, what she thought of the rain. She read everything she could find in the household databank. She had seen the moon. She thought rain was interesting. Cedral had precipitation, but it was different, more like a fine mist that gathered and fell in sheets, less individual. She'd read that Earth rain was different by biome, and she'd been trying to categorize the local variety. He poured more tea and listened to her talk about rain taxonomy and felt something shifting in his chest. Some tectonic readjustment that he hadn't expected. Lyra, he said, when there was a comfortable enough silence to say it into. I'm going to ask you something and you don't have to answer. She went still. The trained stillness, the brace for impact kind. I'm a doctor, he said, and I pay attention to things. That's just how I'm built. He kept his voice level, factual, the tone that said, I'm not going to perform emotion at you. I want you to know that there are people, human people, and people at the Alien Services Bureau who pay attention to these things professionally, who are there to help if help is needed. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to say anything right now, he said. I'm just telling you that those people exist, and that one of them lives across the street if you ever needed to say something. She was quiet for a very long time. Then, in a voice so precisely controlled that he could hear the effort it took, she said, Secondary-born Salathi do not traditionally have access to the same family resources as primary-born children. This is not illegal on Cedral, though it is being reconsidered in the current legislature. I am not certain of the legal situation here. I can tell you, Marcus said, that the legal situation here is that all minor children, regardless of species or family structure, are entitled to the same basic standards of care. She processed this. He could see her processing it, the careful, systematic way she worked through information, like someone who had learned to treat every piece of data as either a resource or a threat. That's useful to know, she said finally. Yes, said Marcus. It is. He'd asked her at some point in the middle of the second cup whether she had friends, peers, anyone she communicated with. The household databank had communication functions, she said. She used them for research, not communication. Were there Salathi children in the neighboring houses? There were, but they attended the private transport school, and she had not been introduced to them. And in any case, she said, with a careful flatness, secondary-born children did not typically maintain social contacts that might complicate the family's standing. He filed that piece of information away. What do you do, he said, when you've finished in the databank for the day? She considered this question with the same thoroughness she gave everything. I think, she said. I read whatever I can access. Sometimes I observe from the upstairs window. I have been cataloging the weather patterns this year. We've been here long enough now that I have a full year's reference set, which allows for comparative seasonal analysis. A child who cataloged weather patterns from a window because she wasn't allowed outside. Marcus kept his face neutral. It was a skill. And you remember all of it, he said. The legal statutes, the case records the weather data. She looked at him. Yes, she said, as though this were an obvious thing, which he supposed for her it was. I have a very good memory. There isn't anything else to use it on. He left that sentence to sit in the room with them for a moment. She left at precisely the 4-hour mark, the thermal wrap still folded over her arm. At the gate she turned back. Your tea is better than the recordings suggested, she said. The ones I read about human tea customs, they made it sound more complicated. Most things are simpler than the recordings suggest, Marcus said. She considered this. Then she said, I will think about what you told me, about the people who pay attention. Take all the time you need, he said. He watched her cross the street and go back inside, and he stood at his gate until the door closed, and then he went in and called Tran Fuang and told her it was time to move. Part 4, The Inquiry. The Regional Alien Services Bureau moved carefully, and it moved fast. Tran Fuang had been building the pre-inquiry file for 2 months. She'd quietly contacted the Salathi Cultural Integration Office, not the Cedral Consulate, which was Harvin Voran's territory, but the Independent Integration Network, the one run by Salathi who had genuinely resettled rather than maintained their clan hierarchies across space. And she'd learned things that made her face go very still when she told Marcus about them. The secondary-born practice, she said, is considered a cultural relic by about 80% of modern Salathi. The integration network has been flagging families that continue it for 3 years. The Vorens are on a list. They're on a list, Marcus repeated. A list that nobody actioned because the Central Consulate made noise about cultural autonomy every time anyone tried. Marcus thought about a bowl on the ground in the rain. Action it now, he said. The visit happened on a Thursday morning. Marcus wasn't there, he wasn't supposed to know about it officially, but Tran Fuang called him that evening. She confirmed everything, Tran Fuang said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. She was more forthcoming than we expected. She had Marcus. She had apparently been thinking through the legal situation quite carefully. She knew the relevant statutes. She'd looked them up in the household databank. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. She also provided testimony that went considerably beyond what you'd observed, Tran Fuang continued. The detail and precision were, she's not an ordinary child, Marcus. She's been building a record, in her head, I think, for a long time. What happens now? Emergency protective order, pending full inquiry. She'll be placed in temporary residential care while the case is assessed. There's a Salatha specialist family in the network, experienced with cases like this. The Vorens are being informed as we speak that they cannot leave the regional jurisdiction. A pause. Harvin Voren has already called 3 lawyers. Of course he has. It won't matter. The evidence is clear and the Bureau has jurisdiction. The Central Consulate can complain all they like. The integration agreement gives us full authority in cases involving minor children. Marcus stood on his porch. The house at the end of Callaway Street was lit up, and as he watched, he could see movement in the windows, the sharp, agitated movements of people who had just realized that their carefully maintained arrangement had come apart. Tran, he said. Yes. Will she be okay? A long pause. She's resilient in ways that are, Tran Fuang started again. She's been surviving for a long time, Marcus. She's very good at it. We're going to try to get her to the point where she doesn't have to. Part 5. What Lyra knew about herself. What Marcus didn't know. What Tran Fuang learned in careful, session-by-session disclosures over the weeks that followed, was the full scope of what Lyra had been doing in that house for 3 years. She had access to the household databank for educational purposes. They'd allowed her that much, not out of kindness, but because an uneducated secondary child reflected poorly on the family's public standing, and because she was useful for certain tasks that required reading and calculation that the sons found tedious. What the family had not anticipated was that Lyra read everything. She read the Resettlement Act, all 400 pages of it, including the annexes. She read the Regional Alien Services Bureau Procedures Manual, which was publicly available, and which she'd found by following a chain of legal cross-references that began in a footnote of a cultural integration document. She read the case records that were publicly accessible in the regional legal database, anonymized, but detailed enough for a careful child to understand the shape of what was possible. She had read, 4 months before Marcus Webb crossed the street in the rain, a case summary involving a Salathi secondary-born child in a different region who had been successfully removed from a similar situation, and was now, the record noted, in full-time education with an adoptive family. The name was redacted, the outcome was not. She had started keeping a mental record the next day. She had decided, with the systematic thoroughness that she applied to everything, that if conditions were going to change, then she would make herself ready. She would know exactly what had happened, and when, and she would be able to say it clearly and completely to whatever reliable adult eventually appeared. She did not know when that would be. She had calculated, she was honest about this, in the slow, careful sessions with Tran Fuang, that it was possible no reliable adult would appear. She had allowed for that possibility. But she had decided to be ready anyway, because the alternative was not to be ready, and she found that she could not quite manage to stop hoping, even when she tried. Dates, specific incidents. The exact words Harvin Voren had used when he told her, on her 6th anniversary in the household, that she should not expect any formal education because secondary-born children were not enrolled in clan schools. The specific composition of what she was given to eat versus what the family ate. She'd looked up nutritional standards for Salathi children and had calculated, with the household's own databank, that she was receiving approximately 60% of the recommended intake. The temperature records she'd noted during the winter months when she was kept in the unheated storage annex. A mental record held intact, waiting. She was waiting, Tran Fuang told Marcus, for what she called a reliable adult. That's the phrase she used. She'd read that term in a child welfare resource document. She was waiting for someone she assessed as reliable. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What made her decide I was reliable? She said, Tran Fuang's voice did something complicated. She said that you didn't move toward her when you held out the thermal wrap. You held it out and you waited. And she'd read that that was what you were supposed to do with a frightened animal, and she thought it probably applied to children too. Marcus Webb, who had been a field medic and who had learned to keep his feelings tightly managed, sat with that for a while. She also said, Tran Fuang added, that the tea was very good. Part 6. The bloom. Salathi's secondary limbs, when they were properly nourished and the stress that had been stunting them was removed, could recover. Marcus learned this from Dr. Yevon, the Salathi physician who was part of the specialist care network and who handled Lyra's medical assessments. It wasn't guaranteed. The longer the malnutrition and chronic stress had persisted, the less complete the recovery might be. But in a child her age with intervention at this point, the prognosis was considered good. The secondary limbs have significant regenerative potential in pre-adolescent Salathi, Dr. Yevon explained, with the measured optimism of a specialist who had seen enough cases to know what was realistic. The joints are stressed and the growth markers are behind, but they are not permanently damaged. With proper nutrition, a low-stress environment and time, we'd expect to see significant improvement within 6 months, possibly full normalization within 18. Marcus thought about the way she'd had them pressed against her body, the curl of them, the way they flinched. And the rest of it, he asked. Dr. Yevon was quiet for a moment. The rest of it takes longer, she said honestly, but she has something that helps considerably. What's that? She is very, very angry, said Dr. Yevon, beneath all the control, and she has, I think, decided that she is going to be all right. That is not something we can give a child. Either they have it or they don't. Marcus saw her again 6 weeks after the inquiry began. Tran Fuang had asked if he'd be willing to speak to her, not as part of any formal proceeding, just as a familiar face during what was, even in the best circumstances, a disorienting transition. The specialist family was good people, the placement was stable, but 6 weeks was 6 weeks, and familiarity mattered. He drove to the address Tran Fuang gave him, and sat in a small, bright sitting room and waited. She came in and stopped. He'd prepared himself, but preparation only goes so far. She looked different. 6 weeks of proper nutrition had brought some color into her complexion, not dramatic, not the full vivid blue-gray sheen of a healthy adult Salathi, but visible, a warmth under the surface that hadn't been there. She was wearing a coat, an actual coat fitted for a Salathi child, the kind that covered the secondary limb joints. And the secondary limbs, they were still close to her body but not curled in the old way. They were down at her sides resting, not braced. Dr. Webb, she said. Lyra, he said, how are you? She considered the question with the same systematic seriousness she gave everything. Better, she said, in measurable ways. She sat down across from him. The food here is adequate. More than adequate. She said it the way someone says something they are still slightly surprised by. Dr. Yevon says my secondary joint inflammation is already reducing. That's good. Yes, she looked at him. I have been told you provided the initial report to the Bureau. With your confirmation, he said, what you told them mattered more than anything I could provide. I was waiting for a reliable adult, she said simply. It took a while to find one. Marcus felt the back of his throat do something he ignored. I'm glad you found one, he said. She looked at her secondary limbs, at the resting position of them, and then back at him. Dr. Yevon says they will probably fully develop, she said. It's not certain but probable. A pause. I looked up the developmental trajectory. In healthy Salathi adolescents, the secondary limbs become quite, she showed me images. They become quite expressive. Her voice was careful and precise, and underneath it, like a pilot light that has been burning very low for a very long time, was something that might have been, in a less controlled child, sheer undiluted excitement. Yes, Marcus said, I've read that. I didn't know that was something I could have, she said. I understood that secondary-born children had secondary limbs as a biological feature, but I hadn't thought about what they were supposed to become. She stopped, looked at him steadily. I had made a lot of adaptations, she said, to what I understood to be permanent conditions. Marcus nodded. He did not say, I know. He did not say, I'm sorry. He waited because he'd learned that she respected waiting. I am revising a number of those adaptations, she said. It is, a pause, the briefest crack in the control quickly sealed. It is more than I had calculated. Take your time, he said. You've got time now. She looked at him for a long moment. The family in this house, she said, they ate dinner together last night, all of us, at a table. She said it the way she'd said the thing about the rain, that careful, cataloging tone that was also underneath pure wonder. There was a plate with a full portion. For me. Marcus Webb, field medic, quiet man, very boring neighbor, looked at the girl who had eaten from a bowl on the ground and memorized legal statutes, and waited for a reliable adult, and thought that the world was larger and more capable of cruelty than he could forgive, and also sometimes, just barely sometimes, larger and more capable of getting it right. Was it good? He said. It was excellent, she said, with great seriousness. The mineral supplement ratios were slightly incorrect for optimal Salathi absorption, but I've looked up the adjustments and intend to provide a reference document to the household. Marcus laughed. It surprised him it came out before he could manage it. Lyra blinked. And then slowly, like something unfolding that had been folded up for a very long time, she smiled. Not a careful, calculated, this is the appropriate expression smile. A real one, the kind that takes the whole face. Part 7, a year later. The Vorons lost the case. The cultural ambassador defense had failed against the weight of the Bureau's documentation, and the testimony of 3 Salathi cultural integration experts who had explained, in patient and devastating detail, exactly what the secondary-born practice constituted under both Salathi contemporary law and the Regional Resettlement Agreement's child welfare provisions. Harvan Voron had been fined. The case had become a precedent. The Cedral Consulate had, notably, not screamed about anti-Salathi prejudice, because the Salathi Cultural Integration Network had made clear, in terms they understood, that they would not support a defense of this particular practice. None of that was Marcus's concern. His concern was Tuesday afternoons. On Tuesday afternoons, Lyra came to tea. It had been Tran Phuong's suggestion initially, that regular contact with the person she'd identified as her reliable adult would be beneficial during the transition. The specialist family had agreed. And so on Tuesdays, Lyra came across the road to the house with the blue door, and Marcus made tea to the adjusted mineral ratio that she had, true to her word, provided in document form, and they talked. She was in school now. A proper Salathi-integrated school, with a curriculum that included the advanced mathematics that she had apparently been teaching herself from the household databank. Her teacher had described her, in an early progress report, as exceptional. Marcus suspected the teacher had no idea quite how exceptional, but he kept that to himself. What he didn't keep to himself was his reaction to the second progress report, 3 months later, which described Lyra as having demonstrated a notably strong inclination toward advocacy for other students in ambiguous situations. He'd called Tran Fuang to read that line to her, and they'd both been quiet for a moment on the line, the way people are quiet when something comes out right. There had also been, in the second month, a Tuesday tea session that Marcus thought about periodically for weeks afterward. Lyra had arrived with a datapad. She'd been given one for school, a proper student one, and she'd said she'd found something she wanted to show him. It was a paper in the Galactic Academic Journal of Exobiological Child Development about secondary-born Salathi outcomes in different intervention scenarios. She had found it, she explained, while cross-referencing her own case against published literature because she wanted to understand the data. The intervention outcome correlates strongly with timing, she'd told him, with the focused precision she used for presenting research. The earlier the intervention, the better the projected outcomes across all markers, educational, physical, psychological. She'd looked up from the datapad. My intervention was late. I was in that house for 3 years. I know, Marcus said. The outcome projections for late intervention cases in my age cohort are still generally positive, she said. I want you to know that I reviewed the data carefully, and I am not being optimistic for social reasons. The data genuinely supports a positive projection. I know that too, Marcus said. She had looked at him for a moment. You looked it up, she said. I looked it up, he confirmed. They had sat with that for a while, two people who had independently researched the same thing from different ends of the same concern. And then Lyra had said she'd also found an interesting footnote about secondary limb development outliers in the late intervention cohort, and they'd spent the rest of the session arguing, cordially, precisely, about the methodology of the study. It had been, Marcus thought afterward, one of the best conversations he'd had in years. There had been one difficult Tuesday. He needed to be honest about that, even in his own accounting of things. It was in the 3rd month. She had arrived at the blue door with the flat expression that he had learned to read as something being carefully contained, and she had sat down with her tea and been very quiet in a way that was not the usual thoughtful quiet, and finally she had said, I found documentation in the Integration Network archive about my mother. Marcus had waited. She was primary-born, Lyra said. She was from a clan on Cedral that had a formal alliance with the Vorans. The alliance was dissolved. There are notes. She was looking at her tea. She died when I was 2. She died in a... She stopped. Started again. The notes are incomplete. I cannot determine from the available records whether she died from illness or from something else. The documentation is incomplete in a way that is. She stopped again. That is sometimes how it is, Marcus said quietly, with documentation from that kind of situation. She looked at him. Her eyes were very steady. He had learned that she became most still when she was experiencing the most, that the steadiness was not absence but the opposite, something held so tightly it looked like calm. I knew that she existed, Lyra said. I knew that she was why I was in that house. I had not found the specific documentation before. Lyra, Marcus said, I'm sorry. She was quiet for a long moment. The secondary limb developmental records in the archive also include a photograph of her, she said. From a Cedral Integration Office filing. She was, a pause, the longest one. She had the secondary limbs in the full adult development. They were. Lyra spread 2 of her own secondary limbs slightly, not quite fully, still in the earlier stage of her own bloom. They were like this would become, when they're finished. He looked at her secondary limbs, partially extended. He thought about what Dr. Yevon had said about probable full normalization. "She looked like you," Lyra said, and then corrected herself. "I looked like her. That is the correct framing." Marcus said, "Either direction is correct." She thought about that. "Yes," she said finally. "I suppose it is." She had drunk her tea and been quiet for a while, and he had not tried to fill the silence. And eventually she had looked up and said she had also found a paper about Cedral architectural history that was extremely interesting from a materials engineering perspective. And they had talked about that for an hour. And when she left, she had held his hand at the door for a moment before she went, 2 primary, 1 secondary, the same way she would hold it later at the ceremony. And then walked back across the street in the November dusk. He had watched her go. He was, he supposed, already her father in every way that mattered. The paperwork just needed to catch up. She was also, and this was the thing that got him, that crept up on him every single Tuesday, she was becoming. It was the only word that fit. She was in the process of becoming something. The careful, armored, meticulously controlled child who had handed back a thermal wrap with both primary hands because she couldn't keep something that didn't belong to her was still there. Underneath, the precision, the systematic way of approaching the world, the tendency to provide reference documents. But she was expanding into space around her that she hadn't known she was allowed to occupy. The secondary limbs had started to move differently, freer. Dr. Yevon's reports had been cautiously optimistic, and then less cautiously optimistic, and then, 8 months in, straightforwardly pleased. They wouldn't be exactly as they would have been. The joint stiffness from the early cold exposure had left some traces, but they would be close. And Lyra, who had looked up the developmental trajectory and been surprised to learn that was something she could have, now used them the way someone uses a language they are newly fluent in, with the pleasure of expression. She gestured when she talked about things that excited her. Marcus had noticed that first. Then she'd started using them to hold things, books, cups, the natural Salathi four-handed hold that she'd never been able to do before. Then, one Tuesday, she had arrived with a mathematical proof she'd worked out, and she'd used 3 of her 4 secondary limbs to sketch the diagram in the air while she explained it. And Marcus had watched her do it and thought, there she is. There is who she was always supposed to be. "Dr. Webb," she said, on a Tuesday in November, exactly 1 year and 1 week after he had held out a thermal wrap in the rain. Said Marcus, refilling the tea. "I have been thinking about something." "What's that?" She was quiet for a moment. She had a habit when she was about to say something she'd been considering for a long time of going very still first, not the old stillness, the brace for impact kind. This was different, gathered. "On Cedral," she said, "there is a tradition. For secondary-born children who are formally recognized, brought into the primary bloodline." She looked at her tea. "It's not common, but it exists. The integration network has records of it. It's called the name-giving ceremony. The child receives a full clan name." Marcus waited. "My current legal status is..." She made a small gesture with one secondary limb that conveyed, elegantly, the bureaucratic tangle that was her current legal status. "It is being resolved. The integration lawyers have been very helpful." She looked up at him. "I have been assigned a provisional clan name for legal purposes. I cannot retain the Vorin name, which I have no interest in retaining, and I need a clan name for the educational registration. They have given me a provisional one from a dissolved clan register." "I know," Marcus said. He'd been kept informed. "I don't like it," she said simply. "It feels like a placeholder, which is what it is." A pause. "I've been reading about the name-giving ceremony." She looked at him with the direct, assessing look that he had come to understand was her most honest expression. "In the human legal system," she said, "there are similar processes for children without for children in my situation. I have read about them. They are called adoption." Marcus set down his tea. I've read the requirements, she continued, with the focused precision of someone who has done very thorough research. The age parameters, the residency requirements, the assessment process. A pause. I've also read the section on individual adult applicants without current family units. Another pause. You meet the criteria. Marcus looked at her. I'm not suggesting you have an obligation, she said quickly, in a tone that was carefully, precisely not pleading. I'm aware that this is a significant undertaking and that I have she stopped, pressed her secondary limbs together briefly. I have given this considerable thought, she said. I want you to know that I have considered it from all relevant angles, and I am aware that it is not a small thing to ask. Lyra, Marcus said. She stopped. He picked up his tea, looked at it, set it down again. I've been in contact with the integration network, he said, about the relevant legal frameworks for approximately 4 months. She stared at him. I wanted to understand the process before, he stopped, began again. I'm not very good at saying things like this, but I was waiting for the right moment, which I suspect is now. A long silence. You were already investigating it, she said. Yes. Before I mentioned it. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. Her secondary limbs, the ones that now moved freely, the ones that had started to bloom, they were held very still. The held stillness of someone who is trying to contain something too large for the moment. Why, she said. The word came out smaller than her usual voice. Marcus thought about how to answer that. He thought about what he'd seen through a gate in the rain, and what he'd heard on his porch, and what he'd watched across the street for a year. He thought about a thermal wrap held at arm's length. He thought about mineral ratios and reference documents, and a mathematical proof sketched in the air with 3 secondary limbs, and a girl who had looked up what she was supposed to become, and found out there was more of it than she'd known. Because, he said, I look across the street and I see someone remarkable, and I didn't want to watch that from a distance any longer than I had to. Lyra looked at him. Then she looked at the table. Then she looked at him again. And slowly, with the precision of someone choosing to do something they have decided to do, not out of habit, not out of survival, but as a deliberate act of trust, she reached across the table with 2 primary hands and 2 secondary limbs, and she put them over his hand. Not curled, not braced. Just resting, warm. Okay, she said, okay. Epilogue, the name-giving. The legal process took 4 months. It involved, as Marcus had known it would, extensive documentation, multiple agency approvals, an independent assessment by a specialist in alien child welfare, and a review by the Salathi Integration Network that included a direct interview with Lyra, which she had apparently handled by presenting her own prepared summary of the key points in advance. The assessor's report described her as an exceptionally self-possessed and clear-thinking young person, with a mature and realistic understanding of her own situation, and a well-considered view of what she requires going forward. It also noted, in the professional understatement of official documents, that the proposed placement appears to represent a relationship of genuine mutual trust and established familiarity, which is considered a significant positive factor. Marcus had read that and thought about a thermal wrap held at arm's length and counting 11 seconds. He'd told Lyra about the 4-month estimate, and she had processed this in the way she processed things she didn't fully like but had decided to accept. A brief compression of her expression, followed by a practical question. What documentation will you need from me? Nothing you haven't already provided, he said. You've already been the most organized party in this process. She had looked at that one from several angles and then said, I have had a long time to prepare. He hadn't had an answer for that. The ceremony was a hybrid. That was Lyra's preference, stated in writing. She had, naturally, prepared a document, combining the Salathi tradition with the human legal process, because she said it seemed wasteful to choose one when both were available. The integration network provided a Salathi naming elder. Marcus's contact at the bureau, Tran Fuang, attended as a witness. Dr. Yevon attended because she said she had a professional interest in outcomes. The specialist family came. The teacher who had called her exceptional came, with the slightly dazed air of someone who had, over the months, progressively revised their understanding of the word. Lyra wore her coat, a new one, a proper Salathi formal garment that the specialist family had helped her choose, deep blue-gray and perfectly fitted for 4 secondary limbs and 2 primary. Her coloring was vivid now, the full healthy sheen of a well-nourished Salathi child who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. The secondary limbs, which had once been curled inward against her body like something bracing for a blow, rested open at her sides. When she was pleased or thinking hard, they moved freely, that new fluency, that expression she'd learned. She received her name. It was a long name, in the Salathi tradition, a full clan designation that the naming elder had composed incorporating elements of the dissolved clan register she'd been provisionally assigned, and the new human family name, woven together in the way that Salathi naming worked, making something new from the threads. The English translation of the primary element meant, approximately, the one who was looked for and found. She stood very straight while it was given to her, in the serious, gathered way that was entirely her own. And then Marcus Webb, former field medic, quiet man, now her father in every legal and otherwise sense of the word, said, "That's a bit long for a Tuesday tea." And Lyra, who had once eaten from a bowl on the ground and thought that was what she deserved, who had memorized statutes and waited for a reliable adult and built her whole survival on the precision of her own careful mind. Lyra laughed, clear and unguarded and real, with her secondary limbs spread open at her sides. The way she was always supposed to. Humanity's strength was never the weapons or the wars. It was the ones who crossed the street. And word count, ~9, 500 words duration, minutes at 160 WPM *. Channel, HFY Alien Children Orphans. Seed, House of the Living Dead, 1974. Gothic Household, Hidden Cruelty, Compassionate Outsider.